Anyway, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Dahlgren. I'm Director of Operations at Sun Mountain Sports, an international golf equipment developer, manufacturer, and distributor in Missoula, Montana. I'm also a member of the Labor Management Advisory Council on Workers' Compensation and Safety, and a former member of the Montana Chamber Board of Directors. Thanks for joining us today. Montana's workers' compensation system has been a major topic of discussion for decades between premiums and workplace safety. The way our state handles these issues continues to have implications on Montana business climate. Now, nearly 7 years since the significant 2011 reforms the Montana State Legislature had made, we're starting to see some impact trends. Regardless, improving work comp outcomes is an important goal in the Montana Chamber's 10-year strategic plan in Vision 2026 that Webb outlined earlier. With that, I welcome you to our Business Climate Panel on Workers' Compensation. We are pleased to have two leading experts here. Notice they said two and left me off the list. I don't know what. Bridger, thank you for that. With that, I welcome you to the Business Climate Panel on Workers' Compensation, where we're pleased to have two leading experts in Montana systems to join us this afternoon. Lanny Hubbard has served as President and CEO of the Montana State Fund since 2003, and Mike Marsh is current president of both the Underwriting Solutions Incorporated and Midland Claims Incorporated of Montana. For the sake of time, I defer you to the Business Days program to learn more about their impressive careers. I'll kick off things with some background on the LMAC, or Labor Management Advisory Council. Then we'll hear from Lanny about the current state of our workers' comp system, followed by Mike's presentation on safety. After our remarks, we will open things up for questions from the floor. Bridger Malum over here will be giving some signals. He'll be walking around with the roving microphone to make sure that everybody can be heard. So just by necessity, we'll be brief. They gave me all of 10 minutes to recap 10 years of the work of LMAC. And I think that's more to reduce their liability exposure for me being up here behind the microphone than anything else. But I can only give the highlights, and there's a lot of information available, so I'm only pick on some highlights that I thought were noteworthy. So with that, it's always kind of they say kind of a bad omen to be the first presenter after a big lunch, but I'm not concerned about it because I'm about ready to launch you guys into the adrenaline-filled world of workers' compensation. So put on your seatbelts and let's go there, all right? So when I was thinking about what we're going to do as far as a title goes, just so I can kind of make things a little succinct, I thought of three things. First off is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Montana has gotten better, but so have others. And finally, rankings don't tell the whole story, and those things will kind of play themselves out over the next few minutes. But going back a little bit in history, I was minding my own business. I'd just been tenured out of the Montana Chamber Board. I was sitting at home hoping to do some fly fishing. The phone rang, and Jerry Keck from the Department of Labor and Industry, ERD, was on the phone. Said, "Hi, Bill, this is Jerry." And I said, "Okay, who's Jerry? I don't know who Jerry Keck is." I says, "We got a phone call and your name was dropped for a new workers' compensation panel, and we were hoping that you might be available to sit on that." And I said, "Well, where did you get my name?" And he said, "Well, Webb Brown." And I'm thinking, nice try, Webb. So next time I saw him, I said, "Webb, why didn't you call me first?" And he says, "I didn't want to give you an opportunity to say no." So what I did, I went to the two people that really matter, my boss, the guy that owns the company. I said, "I've got this opportunity. Would you mind if I take some company time to do this?" And he said, "Well, I don't know why you'd want to, but if you want to, go ahead." And probably most importantly, I went to my wife and said, "I've got this thing that I'd like to do." And she says, "Well, we'll get you out of the house." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Great, go for it." So with that, with those sterling endorsements, I became a member of LMAC. And LMAC came out originally from when Brian Schweitzer and John Bollinger traveled the state, getting input during their, both before and after their campaigns. I heard two major themes. One was that workers' compensation rates are too high, and from others they heard the benefits are too low. And with that, they decided to go ahead and form the LMAC with a model that had worked well in other states, and they appointed 5 members of management, which I'm a member representing the management side, 5 members from labor, representing injured workers, and we rolled up our sleeves and went to work trying to make things better in the state of Montana and workers' compensation. So Jerry Keck, being the elegant individual he did, I thought it was absolutely sterling because I think in very simple terms, but he said if we were just average in Montana for workers' compensation, this is what we should be paying for workers' compensation right now. Says, but as it turns out, we actually have an injury rate. Costs were driven by two major factors. One of them, injury rate, and then severity or time away from work. He said, we actually injure people at a 52% higher than the national average than anybody else. So instead of paying this, we're now paying this. This is in addition to that, we also have people off of work, which is a cost related to lost time injury wage benefits, are 26% above the national average. So all of a sudden, we're paying this, when if we could just get to average, we'd be paying this. And I thought that was just a great demonstration. And that's where we really started. We started, 52% above the national average for injury rate and 26 above for lost time injuries. And over the course of the time with LMAC, we've been able to make some adjustments, changes, and hopefully some improvements. So first thing we went about, took us about 3 years to get going. After 3 years of the implementation of LMAC, we put together a compromise bill working together with labor and management. We called it the LMAC bill, and through a variety of political machinations, that kind of kicked to the side, and it was probably the state funds. Kevin, this is probably your dealings, but we ended up with Senate Bill 334 as a result as a substitute bill, and as it turned out, that was the only option that we had in the state really to make things better in Montana as far as workers' compensation goes. And what I envision is to simplify things to the point of saying that we had some increased benefits, we had some decreased costs related to that, and all but a few of the benefits were kind of left out of the Senate Bill 334, and we enjoyed a lot of the benefits of the cost benefits. As a result, LMAC, particularly on the labor side, thinks we kind of did them wrong, and as a result there's a little bit of angst. I think some of the people in this room that work with LMAC pretty closely see the lack of trust that may be part of the process now, because they think they were kind of short-circuited on that trade-off there. But LMAC nonetheless has plugged away. We've made tremendous strides since Senate Bill 334. The cost savings were kept, some of the benefits were lost, but things have gone forward nonetheless. We have worked for both the Schweitzer administration and now with the Bullock administration, and some of the highlights for LMAC included, came with Senate Bill 334, were utilization and treatment guidelines that are intended to shorten the time frame between getting approvals, having better outcomes as a result, cost setting for reimbursement levels, and we call that medical fee scheduling. Those are probably the two biggest cost savings that we've had in 334. Claim closure provisions, retroactively reimbursed 4-day wait for long-term disabilities, elimination of benefits for voluntary participation in recreational activities, and then there have been many safety initiatives that these guys will be talking about later. Other items that we've considered is at least considering the idea of getting away from USA OSHA and having a Montana state-based OSHA program which is provided for in law. We came within one vote of moving that at least adventure forward, and we dropped that for at least the interim. Subrogation is another one, a good maybe an explanation for what subrogation is. If a third party is responsible, say in a driving accident that you're responsible for under your workers' compensation cover can subrogate that to the third party insurance liability, and you wouldn't be on the hook for the workers' compensation portion. The thought from the management side is they're double dipping, and from the tort side they're saying, hey, we can't take anything away from the injured workers. They need full legal redress, and that debate goes back and forth. We've discussed the roles of the state fund, which I'm sure Lanny's got some thoughts on, and he may share those. Probably not fully, but at least some. Probably the biggest thing on the horizon right now for the upcoming session, and actually it's already in the works right now, and it's actually not going to take the session, is we're working on the drug formulary, and we anticipate to have great cost savings related to drug formulary. And in my mind, drug formularies are the equivalent of utilization and treatment guidelines for the drug portion of medical benefits. Now I want to excite you further with some data. Yay. So if we talked from the top, Montana's gotten better, but others have. Rankings don't tell the whole story. if we look at a couple different reports, and I'll bring these to your attention. If you go on the Montana Department of Labor and Industry, ERD website, go to the LMAC link, there's all kinds of handouts for the last 10 years, meeting notes, handouts, slideshows, the whole shot about the history of 10 years with LMAC, and this is where some of these reports come from. The first I'm going to be referencing is the Oregon's Workers' Compensation Premium Rates Study, which we always look to Oregon for their every other year, every 3 or 4 year rankings, because those are important to us. We'd like to get to a better place. And the other report is Workers' Compensation Annual Report, and that's put out by the Department of Labor here in Montana. The first statistic I wanted to look at is, actually it's a graph I'm going to look at real closely here. Back in 1998, back in 1998, we were ranked about 12th in the nation. So there were only 11 other states in the United States with higher rates than us. It got better than that, and we went from 12 to number 1. You'd think that's good, but that's bad. That meant we were at the worst, the highest rates in the nation for workers' compensation rates in 2010, just about the time LMAC was getting its feet on the ground. Since that time, we've progressed from the first to we're ranked 11 right now. So as I say, as we've gotten better, things haven't changed. We went from 12th, now we're at 11th. That doesn't sound good, but some of the statistics I'm going to give you later on are going to paint a little bit different picture and not quite as glum. We would really like to get it in the middle of the pack and be better and better, and we have unique opportunities being a small state in Montana, but we also have some special challenges related to Montana, their population, their dispersed nature of our workforce. Excuse me. So claims rates. Claims rates in fiscal year 2012 were 6.2 per 100. That's dropped to in 16 to 5.7. That's an 8% drop. Okay, it's not as good as we'd like, but it paints a pretty good picture that we're making progress as far as the number of claims go. It's going down. Another one, the other major cost drivers was time away from work, and duration during that period of time dropped from 16.1 to 14.4. That's a 10% drop. So those two major cost drivers we talked about, the number of incidents, the number of people we injure, and the time away from work are both significant improvements since the inception of LMAC. Then the part of the message about rankings don't tell the whole story. Excuse me, I've got a graph here that you wouldn't even be able to discern if you looked at it. But basically it says back in the 1986 time frame, the range from the highest to the lowest premium payers in the study group, the 40 plus states that were part of the study here, the range was like $6. Okay, so that we were this far apart. Now at this point in time, in 2016, that spread has come down. We're all getting a lot closer, so although our ranking may have only gone from 12 to 11, which isn't necessarily good, that whole range puts us in a really much tighter pack, and that range now is no longer $6, but it's only $3. So small improvements can actually move us quite quickly through those rankings. In an additional graph, it shows that we were 63% above the median. As far as rates go, we are currently down to 14%. So you can see significant improvements there. Okay, rankings are still not showing great improvement, but we are making group improvements. Another thing that's probably near to Lanny's heart here is it shows all the different states and the different structures they have. And one of the questions comes to mind is, well, what's the role of the Montana State Fund? This graph shows us that those states with state funds are all over the map, and the addition or the utilization of a state fund is not a good predictor as far as costs go. Montana private industry non-fatal occupational injuries and illnesses incident rates for 100 FTEs is down 20% over that period from 2009 to 2016. So again, a lot of progress. Although we remain almost twice as high is regional states, as far as opioid prescriptions go, our trend is down significantly, while the rest of the region, we're down 13% since 2012. The rest of the peer states in the region are pretty much flat, so we're making progress there, and our drug formulary will hopefully make improvements there as well. So that's the last of the statistics except for one, sans one, that I want to give you. And I wanted to make sure that I got the numbers right. In my mind, we had reduced, since LMAC's inception, the rates that you folks are out there playing your business over the course of the last, whatever it is, 10 years or more, have reduced. In my mind, it was like 42%. But I looked at the graph, and actually over that period of time, and I'm going to read this because I wanted to make sure I had my information correct. It says, attached is the NCCI Montana State 2017 Advisory Report. If you look at page 27, you can see the cumulative loss changes since 2009. The LMAC started in late 2008 and HB 334 in 2011. The loss costs before Senate Bill 334 had to do with the medical fee schedules, and LMAC was involved in those fee schedules. I think it would be okay to say that since Senate Bill, or House Bill, 334, we have seen a 40.5% drop in lost costs, which is a direct correlation to the amount of premiums you guys are paying. And I think it's fair to say that since LMAC started in 2008, lost costs are down 48%. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. We've made good progress. We're not ready and willing to give up on it yet, but putting the first 10 years of LMAC in perspective, I think we're heading in the right direction. So that concludes my remarks. I'm going to have Lanny step up next, then Mike, and then we can have some questions and answers. So thank you for your attention. You can unbuckle your seatbelts now.
I guess you're passing the money along. Is this the honoraria? Or do we have to split it three ways, gentlemen? Here, I'll get this here. Good afternoon. I'm Lanny Hubbard. I'm President and CEO of Montana State Fund, and thank you for joining us today. Bill covered a lot of data about the workers' compensation system and the state of the system, certainly post House Bill 334, which Representative Scott Richner at the time was the sponsor of the House of Representatives. Scott, you're here somewhere. I know you aren't. There you are. A lot has happened since 2011. But I want to bring back the reason why we're here talking about workers' compensation as one of the kickoff issues to the Montana Chamber Capital Business Days, is because workforce issues are invariably related to people, and people's safety is the problem, and keeping people safe, and in particular keeping that workforce of the future safe, is something that I think we cannot talk enough about. We're a rugged, independent breed of people in Montana. We enjoy the outdoors, we hunt, we fish, we ski, sometimes we do very dangerous things. And I believe that after doing this business for over 28 years at Montana State Fund, having served as legal counsel at Montana State Fund, having litigated claims, having worked on the policy side of workers' compensation, that I've seen some perspective about Montana's business culture that I think that we all need to wake up to, and that is that we are all in this together. Large business and small business are in this together. And we all have an obligation, I think, to take initiatives and steps and invest in creating a safer workplace culture in Montana, not just in the job, but also at home. You know, how many of you mow your own lawn? Come on, admit it. I still mow my own lawn. How many of you don ear protection or eye protection or foot protection? A fewer hands. You know, the kids are watching. And our children are watching us very closely, and our habits are passed on to them. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the initiatives Montana State Fund has undertaken to improve the safety culture when it comes to the next generation, but we have more to do with our own generation as well. So workforce, to me, means a healthy workforce. You cannot afford, businesses cannot afford to lose people to needless injury and disease. And there's not a lot you have to do other than pay attention to it and talk about workplace safety, teach people good habits in the workplace, and reinforce it with incentives and disincentives to achieve these goals. Now I'm going to review some of the statistics that Bill just mentioned, but to maybe give you a little bit of different perspective. But really, you know, workplace safety ultimately is the right thing to do. Wellness is the right thing to do in Montana, taking care of people so they can go home safely each and every day. And businesses need stable costs, predictable and stable costs in the system. And I think from our perspective as an insurance company, our job, our mission, our focus has been to provide as much stability in the workers' compensation system in terms of rates, in terms of cost of claims as we possibly can, so that businesses can predict their upcoming workers' compensation costs. And the thing about workers' compensation that's different from all other insurance is that we often don't know the cost of our claims for decades. So we're charging premium today, and we won't know the cost of those claims for those premiums, sometimes for 20 or 30 years. And that's unlike any other kind of business expense, where businesses, they charge a price for a product when they know the expenses of producing and manufacturing that product. Workers' compensation insurance is very volatile and very full of risk over time. Risk of court decisions. You talked about House Bill 334. We are seeing remarkable results as post House Bill 334. But there are court challenges to the provisions of House Bill 334 that have yet to be decided by Montana's Workers' Compensation Court and ultimately the Montana Supreme Court. So the good news, as Bill mentioned, since 2009, NCCI loss costs are the cost of claims, wage loss and medical benefits, plus a percentage for claim administration expense, have fallen 48%. And that's really good news for Montana businesses. Since 1999, we have returned to our policyholders over $216 million in dividends for having safe workplaces, our customers. Also, since 2007, the average rates for Montana State Fund for our customers have decreased 42%. We haven't had a rate increase since 2007. So there's good news that has developed and also some good news on the horizon. But one of the things that Bridger asked me to talk about is, what do we do? What more can we do? And you only have to look at the headlines. And the Billings Gazette this month, the headline, Montana ranks number 3 in the nation for deaths on the job. Now that is not a ranking that anyone can be proud of. Wyoming is higher, but we're high in injuries on the job and death on the job. 50% of all deaths that occurred in 2004 through 2014 were related to transportation incidents. Not a big surprise. We got a lot of roads, a lot of miles to cover. Businesses and our employees travel all over the state on sometimes degrading roads. And we have a problem there with fatalities. The industries that are affected most are construction, agriculture, and transportation. So if we want to look for areas to improve, here's one area. Now this one might be a little bit difficult to see, but it's also a bit of a restatement with the slide on workplace non-fatal injuries in Montana. While Montana is making progress, injury rates still remain approximately 45% above the national average at 4.2 injuries per 100 workers. Focus must be continued on improving Montana's safety culture. And what's wonderful is in 1993, Montana adopted the Montana Safety Culture Act. I don't know if many of you are aware of that, but back in 1993, our policymakers recognized that we need to do something more with workplace safety. And it has some very important provisions for employers to conduct safety education and training, for our schools to conduct safety education and training. It allows carriers to assist employers in improving workplace safety initiatives. And it also encourages the use of safety committees for employers with 10 or more, requires safety committees for employers with 10 or more employees. The challenge with the Safety Culture Act is it has no teeth. It's really a voluntary act, and there's no enforcement responsibility on the behalf of the Department of Labor or regulators. So really, the only way to to get some change in culture under the Montana Safety Culture Act is to take a look at whether there can be some additional incentives, not necessarily penalties, but incentives offered to employers who invest in workplace safety. What is good about this, encouraging about it, since 2011 to 2016, the frequency rate, accident frequency rate in Montana has declined 16%. That's really good news because, as Bill mentioned to you, workers' compensation costs are a combination of the number of accidents that employers have times the severity or the cost of wage loss and medical benefits. It's a simple formula. It's not rocket science. You can follow the cost in any state on those two factors that make up claim costs, frequency and severity. Compared to the national average, however, we're still higher. We're still, there we go. We are still 45% higher than the national average. I want to talk a little bit about averages, and you were cautioned by Bill. This is a map provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I'm going to ask you, the blue are higher rates than average, and the light green and green are lower than average. Black is there's no data. Do you notice anything about this map? Most of the northern tier states have a higher than the national average injury rate. And when you look at Montana compared to the national average, you're taking into account some states with very warm climates, maybe have more highly concentrated population centers, and we need to be very careful not to overread these. So most of those states below the Mason-Dixon line are actually below the national average in injury rates. There may be some other influences in that too. In fact, there's a lot of migrant work that is done in those southern tier states, and there may be a reporting issue in the data as well. So we should be very careful about comparing Montana to averages. And I know it's necessary, but I caution against that because if we don't set reasonable goals for ourselves that are achievable, then we're going to be disappointed. And I do think that we should look at our region. For example, if you look at Wyoming and Washington State, Wyoming has an average rate of 3.4 injuries per 100 compared to Montana's 4.2. Washington State has an average of 4.3. Oregon 4.0. So we're not too far off from states in our region that have ice and snow and great distances to travel. But that doesn't mean we should stop or become complacent. In fact, I think that we ought to be the flagship of reduced accident frequency in the states in our region. This particular slide simply reinforces the fact this is the number of days away from work on the green bars by age group. So workers age 65 or older, the yellow is the number of accidents in each age group on average. So you can see older workers over 65, those of you who are over 65, you're safer, but when you get hurt, you do stay out longer. It takes longer to recover. That's somewhat anecdotal, but here's the data. The very difficult and challenging spot for us is age 45 to 64. You'll see that we have a higher than other age group injury rates. Does this have a beam? Yeah, right here. I'm using that one for you folks over on that side. These two bars here, higher than average incident rate and also a pretty high time loss rate. So we could really make some improvements if we focus on those age groups. But the one I want you to look at is the young workers, the workers from 16 to 19 and 19 to 24, these two lower bars. They're increasingly representing a great portion of the workforce. In Montana, 50% of teens are in the workforce. 50% of teens are already in the workforce. And we need to pay attention to these young workers, as I said in my opening comments, because they're the ones who are going to be the potential injuries of the future and hopefully the non-injuries of the future. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Senate Joint Resolution 27. I don't know if you can see that character at the bottom, but one of my favorite series of movies was Pirates of the Caribbean. And that's Captain Jack Sparrow, if you don't know. And the reason I have it here is not only because I like the movie, but I do think that there's a real ultimate question when it comes to Montana State Fund and our future role with the state of Montana. And that came to head in the last legislative session, with two bills. One was Senate Bill 371, which called for the liquidation and runoff of Montana State Fund. In other words, Montana State Fund would cease to exist. Montana State Fund has been in existence in some form or fashion since 1915, for over 100 years. And it has served the people of Montana well, but there's some real question of whether or not Montana State Fund serves a purpose in the future. And Senate Bill 371 raised that question. So did Senate Bill 369. That was a bill that was sponsored to study the potential mutualization, privatization of Montana State Fund, but keep it as a guaranteed market for Montana's small business. And I should have opened up by telling you Montana State Fund, as the largest workers' compensation insurer in Montana, has approximately 25,000 policyholders. 20,000 of them have premium under $10,000 a year. So Montana State Fund does insure small business in Montana. We are a competitive alternative as well, but we are the insurer that no one else will insure. And that's important to make sure that whatever public policy discussions are had, that small businesses are protected and have, as I said, those consistent and stable, predictable rates going forward. So the ultimate question, my sense of humor, are just whose assets are they, Jack, is the $60,000 question. Most recently in the special session, you know that if you followed it, Senate Bill 4, that passed the legislature and was signed by the governor, transferred over the next biennium approximately $30 million of Montana State Fund assets to the Fire Suppression Fund. It was a terrible fire season. Yes, it was. It was terrible. Tax revenues have fallen short of predictions. People were looking for buckets of money to fill the hole, and Montana State Fund's a target because Montana State Fund is very financially strong for its policyholders and injured workers, and we found ourselves in the middle of that debate. But the question still needs to be resolved one way or another, because current law, or the law before the special session, certainly said that the assets of Montana State Fund are held in trust for the purposes for which they were collected, paying for workers' compensation injuries for the employers that we insure. And this is not a tax, by the way. Workers' compensation is insurance. It might feel like a tax to all of you because it's mandatory, just like liability insurance for auto is mandatory, but it is nonetheless insurance. Employers transfer their risk to insurance companies and do not bear that burden once they transfer that risk. Now, self-insured employers have the risk. They retain the risk. But when you insure with Montana State Fund or a private insurance company, you're transferring your risk. So it's important that insurance companies are solvent. And that's why we have the Department of Insurance, the Commissioner of Securities and Insurance, regulating the insurance industry to ensure that companies doing business in Montana remain financially sound and solvent. It's an important goal that regardless of what your personal position is on whether or not there should be a Montana State Fund in Montana serving as a guaranteed market, whoever is there must be able to pay the claims for decades into the future. So we need to be thinking about the next 100 years, not the next 2. So those 2 bills did not pass. So there was an alternative, and this was sponsored by Senator Vance. This is Senate Joint Resolution 27, and it calls for the study of the Montana State Fund with 2 particular goals in mind. One being the role and costs of Montana State Compensation Insurance Fund as providing the guaranteed market in Montana, that guaranteed market for small business that can't get insurance elsewhere, and study alternate options available for providing workers' compensation insurance, focusing on what's most cost-effective and in the best interest of the state, Montana employees and Montana employers. That committee that bill is assigned to the Interim Economic Affairs Committee. There has been one subcommittee meeting that was held this last fall. The next one is in February 8th and 9th. Here in Helena, so if you're interested in following that, you can certainly attend, but it is also, I think, going to be live streamed. And the committee's role is to figure out what options Montana has for ensuring small businesses, and particularly those that are most vulnerable and don't have the options that larger employers have. and ensure that their costs are as reasonable as possible. One comment I have about the Oregon ranking, I think that while it's tempting to use the Oregon ranking as a proxy for discussions about the cost of Montana's workers' compensation system compared to other states, I caution as well, echo the caution that Bill gave about relying too much on the ranking. Montana has never, since they've done this study in Oregon, and by the way, it's conducted for the businesses in Oregon. The audience of this study is really the Oregon politicians and businesses. And so all the data is aligned with the mix of business in Oregon and payrolls. And so every other state is compared, and there's a number of adjustments made in that ranking study, and you need to be aware of that. But as Bill said, there's no evidence that the system structure is a driver of the ranking of any state. Let me give you an example. Alaska is number 3 highest. We're 11. Alaska is number 3. That's a totally private market mechanism. North Dakota is the lowest in the nation. That's ranked 50th with the lowest rates. It's a state monopoly. You can't purchase insurance in the private sector. So, and then it's a mix all the way through. It's hit and miss. What really is the debate and the discussion, I think, for policymakers in Montana is the cost of benefits, the delivery of those benefits, and the stability of those benefits over time so that rates can be stable for Montana businesses. Another problem we have, you thought that was a problem, opioids. It's a national epidemic. I think you've probably seen the headlines, but this also was just January 2nd in the Billings Gazette. Injured workers in Montana use more opioids and for longer, the report finds. 43% in 2015 of all prescriptions written for injured workers had at least one opioid prescription. 43%. Approximately 40% of all opioid prescriptions were for claims over 5 years old. So when people get addicted, they stay addicted. Nationally, the scope of the epidemic, there's 97.5 million people using prescription drugs, opioids, 2 million have an abuse problem. In 2016, overdoses killed roughly 64,000 Americans, and it's the leading cause of death among Americans under 50, more than automobile accidents. And we've got a problem in Montana. Over 300 of our brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers die because of opioid-related death in Montana per year. So what can be done? Well, there's a great website that the Montana Medical Association and the Attorney General's office erected a few years ago. It's called Know Your Dose. You can go online. It's got a calculator for physicians to use to look at the morphine equivalent dosage and try to assist in education of workers, and this is not just workers. These are people that are hurt off the job that are being prescribed these medicines. And while pain management is important, and I'm not trying to minimize that, the contra risk is that we're actually killing people at an extremely high rate. Drug formularies, which the Department of Labor is engaged in right now in assessing the adoption of drug formularies. As Bill mentioned, it's like the utilization guideline for prescription medications. Use of the Prescription Drug Monitoring Registry. We have one in Montana, but it's voluntary to be reviewed by providers. There was an initiative a couple sessions ago to make it mandatory. That was amended out. Montanans also don't like to be told what to do. So where there's a must, it often gets changed to a may in legislation. I get it, but is it enough? That's the question. Is it actually changing behavior? And if we really care about one another, we want to change behavior. And the choice of how we enforce the prescription drug registry and make people more aware of the drugs that are being prescribed to injured workers, I think is useful. Utilization and treatment guidelines, which have been adopted in Montana, and they are effective, I believe. As providers become more educated on the utilization and treatment criteria, They are becoming more compliant with those criteria, and there are fewer friction points in medical treatment of injured workers post-accident that I think are really bringing a value to Montana. Changing prescribing habits of providers, educating them on this epidemic, it's real. I don't think they necessarily talk about these issues when they go to their medical conferences, but it's something that we need to raise as not only the Montana Chamber as policyholders, but also insurers. And then, of course, taking on Big Pharma, the people that are making money on this. The Attorney General in Montana has just filed a suit against Purdue. A number of states have, the largest private manufacturer of OxyContin, and for essentially false advertising and minimizing the addictive impacts of opioid drugs and medication. But physicians are taking accountability too. These are two doctors. The director, Tom Frieden of the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, says the prevention of overdose, the prescription overdose epidemic is doctor-driven. It can be reversed by doctors. And the Stephen Stack, the 170th president of the AMA, said, for the past 20 years, public policies, well-intended, but now known to be flawed, compelled doctors to treat pain more aggressively for the comfort of our patients. But today's crisis plainly tells us we must do much more and be much more cautious with how we prescribe opioids. So I'll leave you with a couple more pictures. I don't know, it's not very clear, but the guy up on the upper left is Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. He was also in Pirates of the Caribbean. If you got a good look at him, Keith Richards is probably the only one in the world that was well preserved by use of opioids. Most people turn out like the couple in the lower right, and this is really a photograph of an officer checking two people who are stoned out of their mind on opioids. And what's really tragic, if you can see in that picture, behind them is a child in a car seat. This crisis is a family crisis. It's not only a business crisis, but it's something that it's a public safety crisis. So we need to deal with it and be out front. So some concluding thoughts on my part. Claim costs on the severity. I think that medical and wage inflation has been relatively stable. But if there's an uptick in either wage inflation or medical cost inflation, we're going to see increases in upward pressure on workers' compensation costs and rates. Will this stability period continue, is the question. Medical care, we must take initiatives to ensure that we have a high degree of access for injured workers to medical care, quality medical care, and that we continue to manage costs in a fair but aggressive fashion. Emphasizing stay-at-work and return-to-work programs so that workers' time away from work after injury is minimized, and challenges businesses, and particularly small businesses, to be more creative. And then we need to continue to prevent and reduce the adverse effects of opioid abuse. And as I segue over to Mike, because I know he's going to focus on this, it's safety, safety, safety. Safety education of workers, especially young workers that are just entering the labor force, I think tailors nicely with Envision 2026 and the initiatives. We need to leverage technology. It's incredible what they call, you've heard of fintech, financial technology and banking. Well, InsurTech is the emerging technology industry. There are wearables now that, for example, that if a worker's on a ladder, they've got devices that can tell when they're not making three-point contact, or if their balance is just starting to slop, and it'll buzz and warn them that their positioning is wrong. There are devices that can be attached to vehicles now to monitor, for example, interstate trucking, monitor the driver fatigue, speed, all sorts of data that could allow the employer to intercede or to help the worker ensure that they're rested and driving safe. So the world of InsurTech is expanding very rapidly. And I mentioned earlier, I think we should explore strengthening the Montana Safety Culture Act from a policy perspective. At Montana State Fund, we have a new initiative, Growing a Safer Montana. We've given personal protective equipment to high school welding shops and wood shops, those students that are in industrial arts, Over 600 of these students have received personal protective equipment. The exchange for that is we get to talk to them about workplace safety, and it's working, and we've expanded that program in 2018. Next, at the end of the month, we'll be awarding 10 scholarships to post-secondary education students that are studying health and occupational safety at Montana universities and Montana Tech, as well as the trade schools. So continuing to invest and focus in workplace safety, I think, is going to provide the best results and get us on those sheets of paper a little closer to where we want to be. So thank you for your time.
I'm going to leave it for those guys because you can't split 20 between 3. They're going to have to fight over it. My name is Mike Marsh. I'm here to take us on a balloon ride. These guys have been doing statistics that almost make my hair stand up, and I'm in the business. Workers' comp is the most boring thing in the world. And as I told Lanny a bit ago, there's 11 of us that are excited about workers' comp. 3 of us are up here. I hope the other 8 are around. I started in the business in 1974. I'm celebrating my 44th year in the insurance and claims industry. I grew up in Billings. My father owned a company, which I end up owning today. I did 15 years in California and ran 2 insurance companies down there at the home office level. I was in charge of 35 states, workers' compensation, over $1 billion in claims. And significantly, we had workers' comp in California in the late 80s, early 90s. And if any of you have ever heard of stress-only claims, that's in the age where you didn't have to have objective medical findings like we have to have in Montana. All you had to say to the doctor was, my boss looked at me and I feel stress. And that was a compensable claim in California in those days. I've learned a lot through my experiences at the primary level, at the excess level, at the reinsurance level, and I'm going to use that today to try to expand our discussion a little bit. Our company in Billings has claims handling TPA for workers' comp primarily, mostly self-insureds and some insurance companies conflict claims, meaning when their employees are injured, we do the claims for them. Since 2001, 30,500 claims roughly that we've handled in Billings, about $135 million in incurred reserves and claims that we've paid. I'm currently West Coast Region Vice President of the National Association of Independent Insurance Adjusters, which allows me to leave the state, and 2 times a year I get to meet with people from all over the country, and we get to hash out why our states are better than those other states. And when it comes to workers' comp in Montana, it's hard for me to go argue with some of them, especially down south, on why our comp system is better. The one thing I can say, and I will agree with these guys, we have made some tremendous improvements, but we have some challenges, which I'll talk about in a second. I'm also a founding, teeny bit back, as I've talked to Webb and Bridger and Dan, thank you guys for allowing me to be here today. I've had 2 non-fatal motorcycle accidents. I race motorcycles, and so I've learned a lot coming out of a coma, and what I've tried to do in my years after that is give back. As my father have told me, and if you heard me speak before, I'll say the same thing. I'm in the claims business, and here I am donating my time, my money, my energy to make this so that we don't have any workers' compensation claims anymore. I'm doing my best to put myself out of business. That's the basis of this discussion. I'm also on the Drug Formulary Committee. I'm also a founding board member of Kids Chance of Montana, which is an alternative for injured workers that are seriously injured or killed. This is a scholarship group that will give, a nonprofit that gives money to kids for scholarships for those families. That as a background. These guys are right. We are in a state that has been looked at from the outside as abysmal. When the national publications write about Montana, it's worse than when Lanny had the Billings Gazette up there. They look at Montana as a bad place. We're from workers' comp perspective. And when I first met with Webb and we talked about Envision 2026, the thing that has stricken me with that, and the thing that when we started talking about workplace safety at the same time LMAC formed in 2007, 2008, was what can we do as a state not legislatively, but other than legislatively, to make our state better, stronger, and less expensive. And that's when we formed WorkSafe MT. I was on the board for some time, and as you may know, 3 years ago, give or take, no, actually 5 years ago. Time goes too fast when you're this old. Our former governor took the private money of the private-public partnership money and vetoed the bill. So the public money that was helping sustain our message, which was complementary to SafeMT.com that Montana State Fund still does, they pulled the budget. And the company, or the companies that were represented on the board at that time said, let's pull the plug on WorkSafe. Two of us didn't want to do that. Annette Hoffman from SCL Health in Billings and I said, no, we think that this is too much importance. I have 2 children. I moved back from California in 1999 so I could have my kids go to school here, so they could be raised here, they could go to college here, they could live here. I'm not going to give up on them and their children just because this is uncomfortable. We're going to try to do this. So we took it over. I took all of the management and everything, the 501c3, and brought that into my office, and we've done very little for 3 years until I met with Webb, and Webb and I agreed that this was a real good partnership. What we want to do and what Envision 2026 is, which is to get the message out and to begin some social change. That's a strategic objective in 2026. We need to be in the top 10 in business growth and job growth. You can't do that, A, if you don't have a workforce. B, if the workforce comes to you injured or ill. C, if they don't have the skills. We've talked about the skills, and we'll continue to talk about all day tomorrow. The thing that I'm concerned about is the expectations that they bring to the table. That's where we want to go with this today. So let's talk about the perception of Montana. They've talked a little bit about some of the numbers. I'll just run through real quick so as not to bore you with statistics, because I know it makes your hair stand up too. Percentage of median income that Montana sits. If you look at everybody around us, we're 114% of the average, Wyoming 101% of the average, Idaho drops to 97%, South Dakota 90%, North Dakota 48%. Leaving aside all the reasons why, if you're a business and you're looking at relocating some of your operations in Boise or Bismarck or Cheyenne or Helena, and you have a perception that Montana is a climate that's going to be more expensive, where do you think the folks are going to look? They're probably not going to look at Montana. We have to change that perception. But on the other hand, is the cost of workers' compensation, so this is where we start to rise the balloon up a little bit, is the cost of workers' compensation actually significant? In Montana, if let's say we write about $300 million in premium to place insurance with private insurers, state fund, and some kind of calculation to see how much it should be for the self-insureds. Let's say it's $300 million. There's about $15.5 billion of retail sales in the state of Montana. That's less than 2%. It's not really a significant cost when you look at it in the total cost of doing business. It's a significant cost perceptual-wise. We're also not statistically insignificant when you compare us to what goes on nationally. So we try to say to ourselves when we're in our silos having our meetings, the workers' comp people, well, we really got to do this because we can reduce costs by 30% or 22%. But when you look at the whole United States, $62 billion is the cost of workers' comp in the U.S. versus about $300 million in Montana. You think we have anybody's attention? We really don't. If we're going to do something significant and lasting for ourselves, we've got to do it ourselves in our state. What causes these perception problems then, besides the funny statistics that we've all talked about? I'm going to run through a list of things. When I go to my national meetings, I talk to companies from out of state when we work with our out of state insurers or their brokers, because we do that at least twice a week. Here's the list that they have given me. 1, we have a pretty liberal constitution. when you compare ours to others, we have a constitution that protects the individual more than business. I'm cool with that, and I love that we live here, and I love that my kids are going to be protected by that. But we have to admire that one of the issues we have amongst all of us is we're not going to change the Constitution. I don't think in my lifetime that we'll have a constitutional convention, and I don't think we'll have a bill that passes muster to get through both houses of the legislature and signed by a governor that changes the Constitution that's going to allow for one of the things on my list. It's not going to happen. So we have to accept that as a state. Other people view us as a pretty liberal jurisdiction and a liberal judiciary. We're in a state that has one judge. Every claim that's filed in the state of Montana, if it's going to go to a lawsuit, it's going to go to a judge. That's a judge that's politically appointed by the governor at the time that opening is there. Not necessarily something I'm an advocate for. In fact, 4 sessions in a row I've suggested maybe we should go to a 3-judge panel, but it doesn't go very far. Our Supreme Court is viewed as fairly liberal also. When you compare our rulings compared to other states, generally speaking, we favor the individual over the business or the insurance payer. Okay, we're probably not going to change that in my lifetime. A big deal that we have in Montana, and this really hurts our perception, is what is an occupational disease. If you're not in the business, you think, oh, that's black lung, or it's a fireman that contracted some kind of nasal condition, and so that's an occupational disease. OD in Montana is designed completely different. How it handles any work condition that's supported by objective medical findings that happens over the course of more than one work shift. So if your back's sore from 2 days of lifting, that's allegedly an acceptable workers' comp claim. That's way different than almost everywhere else in the country and doesn't give us a good perception. A challenge this is deep in the claims now. The challenge that we have is in Montana, we have a court and a Supreme Court that's validated this. The treating physician, the chiropractor, or the naturopath, or whomever is the primary treating person, provider, carries the weight over the opinion of an IME, independent medical exam, or an independent medical panel physician. So even in a case, and I'll give you one case example, we handle the claims for an underground mine. We had the independent medical examiner go to the mine, took samples, reviewed all of the MSHA, which is the mining example of OSHA, took all of those air samples and looked at those for years, did a full examination of the person that was claiming a lung condition, and came out with an 80-page report. Most IMEs that we see are 3, 4, sometimes 10 pages. An 80-page report. That 80-page report came back and said this is not work-related, it could not have been created by work, and this is the cause, which was an other than occupational cause. We took that to the treating physician and said, do you agree? And he checked no, with no explanation. And so it leaves us in the case of an accepted claim with lifetime medical benefits. He's a permanent total, probably a $4 to $5 million claim, and isn't work-related, with a competent physician versus a different one. That's a challenge, and that's a thing that causes our perception problems. I'll bring up on subrogation. Subrogation we're a joke in the United States. We don't allow subrogation. It's against public policy. That's a specific line in the Supreme Court case. Subrogation for workers' comp is against public policy in Montana unless the user has been made fully whole, and they can't be. It's by definition can't be done. So what do the insurers look at? How do we get through this? I compare us to Sacramento County. Montana, the whole state, has 1,050,000 residents. Sacramento County, 1,005,000 residents. Total retail sales, 15.5 billion here, 15.2 billion in Sacramento County. Payroll in Montana, 37.2 billion. Sacramento County, 28.4 billion. But here's why insurers look at us askance. We have 6 people per square mile. They have 1,470 people per square mile. You think they're going to make an investment here on an area where they perceive it to be adverse to their condition? and have to have service problems of handling the giant area that we have. Not going to happen. So we talk about this nonprofit. The nonprofit was called WorkSafe MT, and we will continue under that name. We are going to do a branding exercise because Lanny and I compete. We're WorkSafeMT.com and he's SafeMT.com. And that's okay because I love what you guys are doing. And they funded us for a long time. And we had to say no, we have to stop until we get a reformation. That's why it was great when Webb and I got together and started talking about this. We're not going to deal with legislation. We're not going to deal with any of these details that we talked about. What we're going to deal with is from up in the balloon. We're going to look down at the entire country of Montana and say, okay, how do we change our expectations? We can't change how people perceive of us. We can't change the Supreme Court. We can't change our Constitution. But we can change how our kids think. When they're in junior high and they're in high school, we can teach them an expectation of safety. We can teach them an expectation of their boss, of a safe environment. That's what our nonprofit is set to do now. We hope that you'll join with us. We have a 10-year return on equity model. This is not something that's going to return next week. We do hope that some of the legislators will hear us and see it in their heart to bring some legislation, to bring some money to us. That would be great. But it takes $500,000 to $1 million a year to get a good public service announcement group out there and to make some change, because we have to change our society. Let's teach our kids that we deserve to remain intact for life. Thank you.
So the script I have in front of me says, I'll go with this part first. Thanks, gentlemen. Now let's have those questions from the floor. And after it says, after questions, no later than 2:25. I think it's 2:35. So we get pretty excited about workers' compensation, you can see. So, Bridger, this is your show. We have time for a few questions?
Don, can anyone hear me? Awesome. We have time for maybe like just a couple questions if you have some of our
So
panelists
please
here.
raise your hand so Bridger can get to you more quickly.
Yeah.
A
Anyone?
question from the floor.
All right. Well, I have one quick one. Just kind of a quick rapid fire answer from each of you. We've heard a lot of statistics today. Really great information. What I'd like to know, because you did address a little bit about the state rankings, and we need to be a little bit more, I guess, all-encompassing in how we evaluate how we're doing as a state. What's the one other metric that you'd point to be most important in tracking how we're doing as a state, aside from any state ranking? If each of you have a one that comes up among the things you said today.
I'll just real briefly, I like the one that shows the bunching of the range from $1 to $7. So that range when we got started was a $6 range. That's now down to $3. So any little progress that we make, we can move quickly in the rankings. So although it looks like we're still only 11th or 12th in the ranks, just minute improvements can make a big difference. And so we shouldn't be focused so much on maybe our rankings, but as our absolute progress. And we're seeing, 48.1 or 2% reduction in total loss costs. That's a huge thing. That's coming right out of your business expenses.
Yeah, I would just say that I think we are, Montana's an NCCI state, National Council on Compensation Insurance. I had the honor of serving on the board of directors there for 4 years. They provide excellent data, both the 25 jurisdictions that they file loss costs or rates in around the country, as well as Montana. And I think if we stick to the NCCI data and compare ourselves against benchmarks we set within that data on accident severity and accident frequency and Bureau of Labor Statistic data as well, I think those are really good places to start.
I'll take you up in the balloon again. I think that aside from all the statistics, what matters to us most in this regard is the number of companies from out of state that have viewed Montana differently and have moved operations to Montana. That's what I think makes a difference.
Well, thanks. Is there one more question from the audience? All right. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Lanny and Mike, for a very interesting and informative program. We greatly appreciate the time you've had this afternoon. How about another round of applause for the panelists as we present them with a token of our appreciation?